Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, and I'm excited to introduce our guests this evening. If you've attended the lecture series during the past decade, you've no doubt heard Adam Gopnik speak on a range of topics, from the cultural impact of Darwin and Lincoln to the ancestry of the communal meal and the way we eat now. And just a few months ago, he kibitzed here with the formidable philosopher Daniel Dennett about the evolution of consciousness. Not bad for a West Philly kid. A writer for The New Yorker for more than 3 decades and the author of a memoir about his life in Paris and another on rearing children in the Big Apple, Gopnik is a 3-time recipient of the National Magazine Award and a winner of the George Polk Award for magazine reporting. And he has been decorated with the French Republic's Medal of the Chevalier of the Order of the Arts and Letters. Not bad for a West Philly kid. Gopnik's new book, At the Stranger's Gate, sketches the first decade he and his wife lived in New York, and as one reviewer notes, displays his polymathic breadth of knowledge, graceful prose, and a self-deprecating wit that makes it easy to identify with the young couple as they take their first tentative steps toward maturity in their adopted city. Tonight, he'll be in conversation with his friend and best-selling author of The Interestings, among many other novels, Meg Wolitzer. Please welcome Adam Gopnik and Meg Wolitzer to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Most of your books, like your book about just about anything, but you have Darwin and Lincoln. I mean, I can't vouch for the accuracy of what's in those books, but I can vouch for what's in this one because I was there for a lot of it.
Yeah, you were. This is... Meg and I have been friends for a very long time. We've been friends for more than 30 years. But Meg and my wife, Martha, who plays a large role in this book, have been friends for even longer than that. They've been friends since they were in theater camp together, drama camp together, when they were 15.
And I'd like to do an interpretive dance about our friendship tonight. But before I get to that, let's get to you. But we will get to that.
Yeah.
This book flooded me with feeling, I have to say, because it's so much about, it's about life in the 80s in New York. And you rendered it so vivid. Reading it, I felt so much. One of the things I wanted to sort of jump in about was about the question of money, because so many people, when they talk about the 80s, they talk about the go-go years, the Reagan years, the moneyed years. Is that your memory of it?
Well, we had no money, right? As I explained in the book, I had gotten a fellowship from university for $3,500 a year for 3 years, renewable for 3 years. And that was the money we had to live on. And it was really the clock that was ticking in the background of our lives. We'd gotten on a bus to New York City, as in a bad Hollywood movie from the 40s, right, where people dance onto the bus and it says New York on the front. So we didn't have any money to start with, as young couples coming to big cities don't. Of course, as life continued, and particularly after we emigrated from the basement room where we began to a little loft in Soho, you became aware of the forces of money working on everything. One of the things I don't tell in this book, Meg, and I don't know why, do you have this experience too, that after a book is done and published, this one's been out now for about a week, suddenly your mind is flooded with the afterthoughts of all the things that you should have included that were...
Yes, you kind of want to go up to somebody reading it and say, excuse me, take
yes,
a pen
exactly.
and just start making, making some changes.
Exactly. Well, one of the things I didn't include, there's a chapter in here about my first real job. It wasn't really a job, it was a job sort of, as I say. I make the distinction thing between sort of jobs and job sort of, right? Sort of job is a job that's actually an okay job, but you don't actually have it. That's one of the first kinds of jobs you have. And then a job sort of is a job you have, but you don't really want. Well, my first job sort of was a GQ magazine, Gentleman's Quarterly magazine. And I was hired when it was still very much strictly a fashion magazine and largely a gay magazine, produced and read by gay men. And I was sort of the Shabbos goy of GQ in those years as the one...
It said that on the masthead.
As the one straight man on the staff. I think I got a buy because though I was straight, I wasn't obnoxiously so. We had been married, as you have written, this bizarre kind of teenage romance thing. We were married when we were 19.
Yeah. You were child bride and groom. Yeah.
So I wasn't like waving kind of a Sinatra-like flag of heterosexuality around the office every day. I was very much a married little man. But the thing of it was that you became aware of the forces of money, because one of the things that happened was that they, on a Thursday afternoon, or Friday afternoon, when I was out of the office, because I was ostensibly studying to do my PhD, on a Friday afternoon when I was out of the office, they came in and fired the entire staff, which used to happen in magazines back in the 80s, right? And they brought in a whole new staff who were in lots of ways much better for me, because they wanted to make it a sort of literary general interest magazine. And as it became a literary general interest magazine, it was responding in part to the pressures of the New Time. And on the fourth cover that the new editor, a wonderful editor named Art Cooper, put out, the cover featured a brand new, brash, young, arriving New Yorker, Donald Trump. That was Donald Trump's first cover, was in the spring of 1983 in GQ magazine. And you know who wrote the story for us?
Who?
Graydon Carter,
Really?
who just left Vanity, just left Vanity Fair.
Are there
And-
5 people in the world?
Yeah,
Is that
absolutely.
what this is proving? I think.
And the funny thing about it is, and why I didn't discuss this, I don't know. I know why I didn't discuss it, because one of the themes of the book, as you know, Meg, and I'm answering these questions at undue length, I know, and I will, but one of the themes of the book is failure. It's the things because the only things that are interesting in life are the things you're not good at. The stuff that you're actually good at is extremely boring to read about, because you know that story, anybody's memoir is only interesting to the moment, through their failures, to the moment that they first succeed. If you've ever read, one of the most beautiful autobiographies ever written is Charlie Chaplin's autobiography. And the story of his incredibly impoverished and Dickensian childhood is amazing. And then of his getting work in British Music Hall, and you learn the world of British Music Hall, and he goes to America with Stan Laurel on a boat, and he teaches him the violin, and he finally walks into a movie studio in 1915, and in desperation, looking for something to do, he grabs a pair of baggy pants and a bowler hat and a cane, and he becomes the tramp. The book is absolutely staggering up to that point, and every page after that is completely inert, right? Because what happens? He makes a great work of art, and then I make another great work of art, then I meet Jean Cocteau, then I met Albert Einstein.
Right.
You know, all that happens when you get good at something is you make some more of it, and then you meet people.
This is, yeah. This is actually sort of true in fiction, too. I find that it's really hard to write about a successful character from their perspective.
Yeah.
You can look at them and sort of take them down or whatever you want to do, but to write from the perspective of someone really successful is...
Almost impossible. So the point I was going to make is I didn't want to write about the part where I was at GQ actually doing something interesting.
Yeah.
The only interesting part was when I was doing something extremely uninteresting.
Right.
That I was totally unequipped to do. That's interesting because we've all done that, done things we're unequipped to do. So anyway, that was why I didn't mention the Trump cover.
I see.
But it's as an icon of how that time came. And it was like, when, what do you call it? The catfish begin to invade the intercoastal waters. You're not aware of how dangerous they are. At the time, it seemed as though Trump and what he represented was a certain kind of brash, arrogant energy that was healthy for the city in America. We were coming out of that kind of taxi driver time, right, where New York seemed to be hell itself.
Oh, when I got to the city, I felt like every day was like an episode of Kojak. Even that reference, some of you are like, Kojak, what means Kojak? You're too young, you're too young. You have this great line in here about money, and when I think of the 80s, I can recall 1 or 2 shimmering nights when rich men did rule, but I recall more mornings when having a pair of sneakers and a Walkman seemed to mark one as a lover of his time.
Yes, well, I think it's true, but I mean, I was trying to be very specific there, because 2 of the great technological innovations of the 80s, which play a significant role in this book, were serious sneakers and the Walkman, right? Because serious sneakers emerged for the first time out of the primordial soup of canvas and rubber, which we all grew up with, and Converses and so on. And then for the first time you had Nikes and Adidas and Air Jordans and all of those things. So if you're very flat-footed, as I am, like all Jewish men, having
Am I
strong
supposed
sneakers...
to just leave that unremarked upon?
Well, it's true. It's true. It's why there's no Jewish parade in New York. Our feet hurt too much. Have you ever noticed that? The Germans have a parade, the Italians have a parade, the Israelis have a parade, the Jews don't have a parade. Our feet hurt too much.
This.
Our feet hurt. But so having sneakers having sneakers was great. And then the Walkman, suddenly you put the Walkman, does anyone now, people don't any longer remember this because we have all of our Walkman on our little phones, but suddenly you were in a movie every time you left the house because you had a score playing in your head. It was the most astounding thing. I could spend days walking around.
And the city becomes
Exactly.
connected
That's
to
right.
that, like what you were listening to when you walked down 38th Street or whatever it was.
So I think, but in all seriousness, I think that shaped the texture of the time as much as the cliches of greed is good in the Reagan era and all of those things, real though they were. One of the things that fascinates me, Meg, and one of the things that I tried very much to make my material out of is exactly the discrepancy between big official history and small lived experience. That's, and if I have a subject, that's it. It's weird how we live in those spaces. And Through the Children's Gate, the book that, in a weird way, was the sequel to this book, though it appeared 15 years before, it was all about what was it actually like living in New York after 9/11. Not in terms of the cliches, the world has changed, we'll never be the same again, but day to day, moment to moment, imaginary friend by imaginary friend. What's it like living your own experience in the midst of history?
Yeah, I think we go to reading for the granular.
Yeah,
and that is
absolutely.
what you give it,
Another way of putting it, it's exactly, it's something that Meg is an extraordinary novelist, and I am not an extraordinary novelist. I write these weird little memoir essay things, but I think that the business of trying to make private life public is exactly what where we resonate together.
You really nailed it at the idea of, in the 80s, most notions of equality dissolved, but so did most notions of gentility. And that brings up somebody like Trump. I mean, I was going to build to him, but here he is. Here he is again.
Well, I actually said, and if you'll forgive me because I have to use an obscenity to tell this accurately, but one of the things, what I say there is that in 1960, Lenny Bruce was arrested for saying cocksucker in a nightclub in California. By 1985, you could say cocksucker in any nightclub in California, and Ronald Reagan was president, right? Or a better way of putting that is, by the time Ronald Reagan was president, you could say that word.
Right.
And so the point is that we tend to think that politics and culture go along in lockstep. If you have reactionary politics, you have a very reactionary culture. It doesn't work that way.
No, and in fact, even in terms of art, do you want to comment on that? I find art really bursts out during repressive times.
Sure, absolutely, and it bursts out in very unpredictable.
Well, I don't mean in other countries necessarily where it's kept down.
Right, but no, it's true. It's true in our own. As you know, I mean, it's one of the. There's a long chapter in this book about Soho in the 1980s. Soho, the New York neighborhood, which was the capital of the art world in those years, and one of the things I try and do in that is to say, well, how did the art of the time mirror the time? And it's never in a simple way. Art doesn't mirror its time just by holding a reflective surface up to it. It's more like a kind of trap, like a kind of mouse trap in which the time gets entangled without our being fully aware of it. Put it simply, I don't know how many of you have seen or remember Jeff Koons' Chrome Bunny. It was sort of an icon at that time. It was a balloon bunny that he encased in metal. And suddenly this harmless child's balloon bunny became this kind of evil, demonic, cold thing. And it looks like the demon of Trump Tower is exactly what it is. And it's what it looks like. It looks like the evil demon of Trump Tower. And that's the way, without a lot of self-consciousness, that I do think art traps time.
Oh. Speaking of Trump, also, you said your father gave you great advice before you came to New York. He said, never underestimate the other person's insecurity. And we are living in that moment, right?
Absolutely. I mean, big. My dad meant it. My dad, of course, is a Philadelphian, grew up on Olney Circle and went to Olney High and Penn, as did my mom. That's an old Gopnik family tradition, is getting involved. They went to high school together, my parents.
Really?
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Yeah. Isn't it weird? And you want to know something truly weird, that I mentioned in the book? I only had one set of grandparents because
this is crazy.
This is truly weird, right?
This is really weird.
Because after I was already born and my parents had been married for a few years and my older sister Allison had been born, my father's father fell in love with my mother's mother. And they divorced their spouses and they married each other. Right here, at a magistrate's, and moved up. They had a house on Broad and Olney in Philadelphia.
That's like a solution to one of those things. How is it possible that man's son,
yes, exactly,
those children's is my mother's wife? Right?
What made it so funny, Meg, was that my parents, I hope everything now is permanent. We were saying earlier today, you don't get away with anything these days because everything is permanent. But My grandparents, my father's father, was very much like my father, not highly educated as my father was and is, but a gentle, humorous man. And my mother's mother was very much like my mother, hugely super smart, Portuguese, quick and impatient woman. And so we had a kind of tuned version of my parents living in Florida, well, actually first living on Broad and Olney and then in Florida, all the while I was growing up. They just were exactly like my parents, only they spoke with heavy accents.
And you are following,
and we're following
the tradition. Let's talk about some specific things in the book. This is such a wonderful book. You will really love it. I loved reading about things that I'd sort of witnessed and seen before, but hearing it more textured, closer grained, was absolutely wonderful. And one of the set pieces in this book, and there are many really wonderful scenes, takes place in your loft, which is a place that I visited
countless times.
Countless times. Can you talk a little bit about the shocking secrets embedded in your loft and in your building?
You're thinking of the blood.
Yes, the
blood.
yes.
The blood. We lived in this building, in a loft building on Broome Street, and basically this book is about vermin. That's kind of the overriding theme of the book, because in the first apartment we live in, which was a 9 by 11 room, it was a basement room, and we were such innocents that we didn't understand that it would be guaranteed to be overrun by cockroaches every night, which it was. We finally escaped the cockroaches. We got this loft in a 150-year-old building, which no one had looked after in all that time, and it just had been sort of occupied by artists, and it was overrun with mice. And one of the fascinating things about it is we were living there, and suddenly blood started oozing out of the walls, and it was really creepy. And
Gopnik, the king of understatement.
And your good friend Martha, my wife, insisted that we do. My approach to anything is to try and ignore it as long as you humanly can. But Martha said, we really have to look into this. And the story is told in the book. We found out finally that our building, which had been designed by an architect named Elisha Sniffen, was in fact, had been a candy factory in the 19th century, where poor immigrant labor had been enslaved to make candy. And somehow, I know this sounds like a ridiculous joke, but I swear to God it's true. All the molasses and so on had entered the walls as it was being, cooked at 1,000 degrees, and it continued to seep out. And I swear to God this is true, because if you could work up the nerve to taste it, it was incredibly sweet. It's 150-year-old. The blood was actually syrup.
Your neighbors said this great thing. The thing that's really mysterious is why up on the 6th floor we have sugar syrup, while down here on the 4th floor you have molasses.
That's right. Those are all true stories, by the way. Those are all. Well, you knew that building. The climax of the book, in a certain way, is finally after living through mice and sugar syrup and our artist neighbor upstairs who worked in week-old dead carp. That was her working material. And hay. And so one night I had to move a haystack because the building started moving in the middle of the night. I had to shift hay around. We had an attack, God help us, of rats. We had the whole building got, that might be good if you were saying I should read something. Let me read that. Let me read. And so it was sort of it's kind of the climax of the book. So why am I reading the climax of the book at the beginning? But
I know, we're really going out of order, but it's okay.
Yeah.
They're a quick bunch.
Yes. And this extraordinary exterminator named Gilbert, who was West Indian, came to help. And Gilbert went to look at the rats, and came back, and he said, "Yep, you got them all right. You got them. You got the big boys." And I said, "Well, what do you mean we got the big boys, Gilbert?" And he said, "Let me put it this way. These rats, if you see one, they look at you like you the problem." Which told you. So, finally, and he kept saying, "You've got to come down to the basement if you want to understand the problem. You have to come down to the basement if you want to." I had no desire to go down to the basement, but finally we did. After a lot of twists and turns, we came to what I realized was the space just under the sidewalk. I could hear the welders buzzing away, still at work outside. I had hired welders. I had done this myself, actually, to weld the building closed. A black hefty bag was standing on the floor. Gilbert waved his flashlight towards the bag. "I got some one-pounders in there," he said jovially as he picked up the bag. It sagged with the weight. "Now look," he said, pointing towards the space under the sidewalk, and I did. The space was simply open below street level to the underside of the whole street. You peered out and you could see pipes and ducts in the underside of asphalt. You could hear the N train running over on Broadway, 3 blocks away. "You see," Gilbert said with uncharacteristic emotion, "that's why you had to come down to the basement. That stuff, that welding you're doing, that is a joke. This place is open to the world. They're coming in and going up and there and there and there." He pointed his flashlight at the top of the basement walls. "Nothing's been done here since the 19th century. My family was slaves the last time somebody came down this basement." It was an exaggeration, but I got his point. "What you're telling me, Gilbert," I said finally, "is that there's nothing to be done, that everything I'm doing is not going to do any good." I felt sick. "No, I am not telling you that," Gilbert said. "I'm telling you that there's no solution. You can't keep the rats out of your building. It would take $20,000 worth of masonry. It would take a century's upkeep that somebody forgot all about to keep the rats out. I'm telling you there's no solution, but there's a technique. Did I tell you about the 3 cons?" I shook my head, helpless. "Okay, the 3 cons. We got to contain, confine, and convince. We got to contain the rats in one area of the basement. Then we got to confine them to one feeding place. Then we got to convince them that this is not a happy place for them to be. We move them on to the next building, where there is another basement, just like yours. You can do that." And I always thought, as I say and I go on, Gilbert's philosophy of containment seemed to me at the time to strike some deep, permanent truth about New York. And that's sort of, for me, the climax of the book, is that we sit on ruin in lots of ways, in New York particularly, but in any big old city. You know, we patch together our lives around the unimaginable. And for a while, we think we're going on until finally we're picked up and pitched out, just like the vermin we represent, in fact. It's a pessimistic turn, but I think not false.
Well, it's a good moment to now turn back to what I should have said at the beginning, which is you came from Canada.
That's right.
So it wasn't like this in Canada?
No, my parents moved from...
Did the rats have ear flaps or something? What?
My parents moved from Philadelphia to Montreal, Canada. Really, they were going from... They're academics. Academics are like mendicant monks in the Middle Ages. They don't go from country to country. They go from monastery to monastery. So they were really moving from Penn to McGill University. And Rutgers and Penn to McGill University. And in Canada, people are truly painfully polite. And you know my favorite Canadian joke is, how do you get 25 Canadians out of the pool? You say, "Please get out of the pool." And that's true. Martha, my wife, who is the mucilage of our long and intimate relationship, as you know, I would think Judy is the most polite human being you've ever met in your life.
Oh, yeah, incredibly
polite.
She makes us feel like, give me that, like,
exactly.
Right? Like that we're saying
everything
that
you do
everywhere.
seems gross because, and she genuinely believed, this is how Martha fought the infestation of mice we had when we had the mice in love. She would walk in, stamp her foot and say, "Mice, go away." And she genuinely thought that would work. And so Canadians believed that. So it wasn't so much that we thought that the vermin were biddable, as we just thought that everything was manageable, because that's basic Canadian.
So did New York strike you differently from how your Canadian dreams had gone?
Oh, yes. I mean, but it struck me as differently in 2 different ways. One way that was different, that no one expected, was that by the early 80s in New York, as you remember, the real estate crisis, which is a permanent feature of the Western world, and certainly of big cities, had struck. So one of the things that, when we were coming to New York, I had assumed that we would get an apartment, kind of 5-story walk-up apartment, because those are the kinds of apartments you saw, in Barefoot in the Park and Sunday in New York, and
somebody's always catching their breath.
Yeah, exactly.
At the top.
Barefoot on Sunday. That 5. And I thought, well, that would be fun. But none of those apartments were available. All that anyone you could see were basement apartments. They called them garden apartments. Yeah. And I realized why that was after a while. It was because the people who in 1961 had rented the 5-floor walk-ups had never left them, right?
Yeah.
They were there permanently. And I said that as a joke. And then I was reading Neil Simon's autobiography, which is an extremely entertaining book. And Neil Simon explains, I don't know how many of you remember Barefoot in the Park, that wonderful play and movie with Robert Redford and Jane Fonda. And all of that was true. That was the first apartment, one room, 5 floors up, that he and his wife had rented. They were still living in that apartment with one child when Barefoot in the Park opened on Broadway,
Wow.
which meant you had to be the most successful commercial playwright of your time to move, to get to move. It's really a game of musical chairs with no music and no chairs, right? So that was one thing. It was just how insanely compressed our lives were. I don't just mean physically, but how New York, rather than being, I had a kind of Gershwin-esque dream of New York, if you know what I mean. That is of this city of it's like Woody Allen at the beginning of Manhattan, the city of dreams and energy and great guys and gorgeous gals and so on. And what we actually experienced was this world of these incredibly intense inner worlds, right? I don't just mean apartments, but galleries and homes where people's imaginations seem to have implanted themselves inside. And at the same time, the world outside was getting bigger and colder and more impersonal all the time. And that was the space. I called it, sort of in my own idiosyncratic language, the Blue Room, which is what we called our own little apartment, and the big store, meaning the big world outside. And the space between those two existences, I thought, shaped New York life, shaped American life, I suppose, in ways that were very different from my expectations. Dick Avedon, who's, as you know, was a dear friend of ours both, the great photographer, figures very large. He's sort of the hero of this book. He's sort of the benevolent demon in the book. And he, benevolent angel, I guess a benevolent demon is called an angel, isn't it? That we have a simple word for that. And
maybe you didn't know it up in Canada. We have it here. We have that word here.
And he represented, among many other things, he represented the spirit of that lost, optimistic, enterprising, artistically confident New York that seemed to us.
Yeah, by the time we got there, that wasn't there. We
Yeah.
had to, but you're such an optimistic person that you had to sort of create that. But I think partly we created through other people. And one of the things about this book is that there are so many characters who come to life in it. Jeff Koons and people you worked with, and Dick Avedon particularly. The idea of being, can you talk a little bit about being a young man with an older man kind of taking you under his wing? It's such a beautiful section.
You should. Thanks, Meg. I think one of the key experiences, if we're lucky, and almost all of us get it in some form or another. I was lucky enough to get somebody who was extremely well known. I know your new novel, which will be coming out next year, right?
In April.
In April, is also about the relation of a mentor and protege.
Sure.
And that's one of the richest relationships that I think life provides us. We have a relationship with our parents, our own relationship with our children, relationship with our spouses. But in addition to that, probably the richest non-genetic relationships we get in life are the relationships we have with a great teacher or a great charismatic mentor. And sometimes the great teacher is a great charismatic mentor, but often not. So Martha and I were lucky enough just to fall by accident into a very intense relationship with Richard Avedon, the photographer, who was, in addition to being a wonderful photographer, was a man of enormously incandescent presence. And over the years, we all became friends. We used to all celebrate Thanksgiving together in memorable evenings. And what made him extraordinary, I think, was exactly that, to use Fitzgerald's phrase, his extraordinary readiness for experience. And that seemed both a beautiful thing in itself and also an increasingly lost element in life, and that sense of spiritual adventure, of artistic and emotional adventure, and also of artistic and emotional possibility. That Dick Avedon had come of age in the 1940s at a time when, as John Updike wrote memorably once, the United States had strangled, like Hercules, had strangled 2 serpents in its cradle, meaning Japan and Germany, and suddenly bound forth with limitless possibility. And Dick Avedon, as a very young photographer, got in a boat going over to Paris in 1947, just as Paris fashions were coming back, and became a child wonder, kind of wonder boy photography. And so, can I read? I'll read one more thing. I'd love to read a little set piece from the chapter about meeting him. And so in addition to his own extraordinary presence, I wanted to write about that experience. And as I say, I know you're writing about it too, or have finished a novel about it, about what it is to be adopted by somebody who you admire enormously, and you say, oh, this person is my pattern for living. Inevitably, it turns out not to be the case, right? That that no one can become your pattern for living, because the only pattern for living you can ultimately supply is your own.
Right.
And that's the inevitable thing that happens between mentors and proteges, is that if you don't become disillusioned, you have to grow up within it. But let me just describe something that I like. He embraced me, not awkwardly at all, and then he led me into the most beautiful room I had ever seen. This is the room where he worked. Can I describe it adequately or at all? Let me try. It became my favorite room and the pattern of my own later organization of existence, my template of the best way to live. The walls were lined with soft white fabric onto which you could pin up any image, a changing small circus of images that had snagged on his mind and that he had torn or raggedly cut from magazines and newspapers and postcards. They were informed by a distinct sensibility that knew exactly where the beautiful intersected the strange. There were his heroes, a torn-off cover of the Post, with Salinger bearing down on the photographer, Chaplin out of character, as romantic young poet, curly hair, an open smile, an eerily vindictive and determined Van Gogh baby. Movement everywhere, a Minoan diver falling through air, a Remington chief pointing a bow and arrow, a Fra Angelico angel as chromatically plumed as a peacock, rushing the news of the Annunciation to a still startled virgin, and then among them anonymous athletes caught sliding into second or suspended over a balance beam and pinwheeling through space. And I say at the end, finally I understood what they all were about. And it was, I'm sorry, I'm misreading this. Above all, I was struck by his favorite murmured response to anything that pleased his eye. "Isn't that beautiful and strange," he would say, or "It's so beautiful and so strange." There was a strange beauty in the seesaw balance of the and, not strange, which would have gone a long way in my family, not beautiful, which went almost all the way with Martha, not strangely beautiful, which implied romantic mystery, or beautifully strange, which implied romantic excess, but beautiful and strange, as independent categories seen at once with both eyes, the ever-exciting discovery of a new marriage of kinds. That was what drew together all the imagery on the wall. Beauty undercut by an unexpected informality, or by madness, or by rage. That was, and I think that idea, and one of the things that I think I learned very much from Dick Avedon, my own charismatic mentor, was to accept contradiction in life. That contradiction wasn't a thing to be argued against or looked past, but the contradiction was the source of all beauty that we had, things being beautiful and strange, things being graceful and terrible. It's a small instance of it, but as you remember, when Martha, our dear friend, was 9 months pregnant with our son Luke. At the time you were pregnant with your son Charlie, Martha and Meg arranged to be pregnant at the same time.
Yes.
That's true. That's a true story. And their kids went through school together. The sons.
Yes.
It's true. It's true. The two husbands played a very minor role in the whole scheme. Martha looks Dick took a picture of Martha in a white dress, looking extremely beautiful, 9 months pregnant, looking like kind of the pregnant Nike of Samothrace. But when Dick looked at the picture, I said, "Oh God, she looks so beautiful." He said, "Yes, but look how tight her hand is, like a crab, because all the anxiety is going into the hand." And I thought, "Oh, that's so interesting, right?" And learning to accept contradiction, learning to luxuriate in contradiction, was one of the things I needed to do to grow up.
We need to turn this over to questions in a second, but I wanted to say that seems like a wonderful metaphor for the city itself.
Yeah,
the contradictions of the city. And even the word strange, of course, when you were saying it, I was thinking, of course, this is the stranger's gate. This is about the strange things, being strange yourself or seeing something strange.
Why can't you review this book, Meg? Because you understand why. I mean,
I do understand these things.
You set up it. Give me 2 seconds of an authorial rant. You set these things up, and you think, "Oh, no one can miss that, right?"
And then nobody misses it.
And everyone misses it. Don't you find?
Yes, that's why we have each other, and we're just going to take this caravan around city to city, log rolling in our time, to quote Spy Magazine, something else from the 80s. We do need to turn this over to questions pretty quickly, but did you want to say something?
I was going to say exactly that if there's a theme in this book, and I hope there is, it's episodic, and it's a lot of, I hope, it's mostly funny stories about failure. But if there's a thing in the book, if there's a point to the book, it's exactly that contradiction is the source of what makes great cities glamorous, and contradiction is the most meaningful thing in life. And as I say, one of the things that I had to learn in the course of these years was how to write with ands instead of with buts. Exactly, just think beautiful and strange instead of thinking beautiful but strange, strange but beautiful. Yeah. And I think that that's a core thing that all writers have to learn, is how you make narrative out of contradiction instead of making it out of affirmation or assertion.
Right. Well, you do it so beautifully in this book. It's really extraordinary, so please do read it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do you remember the first time we actually met each other?
Yes. Yes, I do.
And do you remember what you said to Martha?
No.
About
now
me?
I'm scared. This is like the newlywed game. There's something horrible and private is about to be revealed, and I don't know what.
And Martha and Meg, as I say, had been insanely close since they were 15. You said, "Oh, your husband looks like Davy Jones of the Monkees."
I did? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
But did I look like Davy Jones?
I love Davy Jones.
Oh, that's good. Oh, that was good.
You've never said this before.
I know. It just suddenly occurred to me sitting here.
We've done all kinds of things.
We've done moth stories together.
Yeah, no, you're right. Very cute. The cute one. Yes.
Well, the cute short one. The cute short one.
Right.
I remember that.
Now you really can understand the book more thoroughly because of that anecdote.
I left that out of the book too.
We had such a beautiful. We ended on this beautiful lyrical note, and now we're
Davy
at
Jones
now we're
has
at a
a
kind
lyricism
of, like,
of his own, I think.
A Beatles knockoff.
I'm just wondering if I can follow Adam Gopnik's lead for a second and ask you a question, Meg. I'm wondering, after enjoying the interestings and particularly the pilot that was done on Netflix, do they ever plan to do the series?
It was Amazon, and sadly, no. Although I can perform a puppet version of no. It's one of those things. But I will say something very exciting and fun, if I may have one second, which is that they just. I just went to the Toronto Film Festival, speaking of Canada, because we go back and forth between those countries, where a film of a book of mine called The Wife was released starring Glenn Close and Jonathan Pryce, and it's so good. She's so great, and look for that next year. So, yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
I was just wondering, as a follow-up, how your experience in musical theater with the most beautiful room in New York panned out for you.
Oh, what a nice question. This very generous and well-informed lady is referencing, it's always been my dream. When I came to New York, and I describe this in this book, I intended to be a songwriter, write musical theater. Sort of be like, Stephen Sondheim, only more commercial. And this was an ambition, and at the time, breaks my heart even now to think about it, that we knew someone who had once been to dinner with someone who had known the sister of Art Garfunkel's psychoanalyst. And that person, we prepared a tape, Martha and I. Have you ever heard this tape, actually?
No.
Martha and I prepared a tape of my songs, because I had written the college show, which was about the life of Vladimir Tatlin, the Russian constructivist architect, which I was sure was 6 weeks from Broadway at that point.
But then you found out that someone else was doing the same show? Yeah.
Julie Stein had already written that. So we got off and never heard back, and that's what I wanted to do. Finally, flash forward 25 years, I actually got to write a musical show, musical theater, musical comedy with the great composer David Shire, and it was called originally Table, and then we changed the title to The Most Beautiful Room in New York, and it opened at the Long Wharf Theater in New Haven this past April.
I was there for the opening. It was
Meg was there for
fantastic.
opening night, and we had a wonderful 4-week run, and with all of the drama and crises that are incumbent and inherent in the musical theater, which what someone once said about American musical theater, the history of the American musical theater is of Jewish men yelling at each other, which is true. And
when they're not on that march
on the march,
Fifth Avenue.
but that's why they're yelling, because they can't walk. Anyway, we had a wonderful run with a terrific cast. A wonderful actress named Anastasia Barzy played our lead. A wonderful actor named Matt Bogart played the other lead. And we're sort of waiting. As always, musical theater is in a constant state. It's like being on a plane that's waiting for a landing slot at JFK and never quite gets there. There's 50 different shows that are circling New York at any one time. And I hope that that sometime we'll land. Whether we do or not, it was the single most stimulating, rewarding, significant artistic experience of a lifetime. In part because as writers, we sit in a room and we do nothing. We
just watch the rats.
Right, exactly. We talk to one. Martha talks to Meg. Meg talks to Martha, and I try to talk to Martha, but she's busy talking to Meg. And that's basically our whole life. But when you're in the theater, you're engaged with a family, an ensemble of people, and over the course of now I did theater here in Philadelphia when I was a kid, when Andre Gregory had the Theater of the Living Arts down on South Street. I was the kid actor in that, so I had it's like Ralph Cramden, the theater's got the theater in my blood, Alice. Right. What's that, Ralph? The second balcony? Remember that? Yeah. Right? It was like that. But I loved the theater. It was a fantastic experience. My chief wish in life for the next decade would be to do still more.
It just seems incredible. One thing, just to go back very quickly to your book, is that there's so many rooms that you enter in this book, and the idea of having a theater where they know you and you're welcomed in because you wrote the thing sounds so wonderful.
It was terrific for 8 hours, and then it gets theater is hard. Theater is just very, very hard. It makes putting a book together look self-evident because the theater in the books, you and I, we're the authors of our books, right? We have editors and we have friends, but we're basically the authors. In the theater, there is no one author. There are 7 different authors competing, and it makes for a very complicated time, but it makes for an insanely rewarding thing when it happens. There's nothing there's no feeling in life as an artist as reward, at least for a writer, as when something that you think was funny or you think was moving becomes inhabited by another human being or by an ensemble of other human beings, and still more human beings in an audience laugh or choke. It's like crack cocaine, or it's like champagne. It's like the greatest intoxicant in a lifetime.
Hi, I just wanted to make a couple comments. One is, whenever I see your articles in the New Yorker, I get very excited.
Oh, that's nice of you.
And there was one article that you wrote recently about, it was about why the United States wasn't like Canada or Australia. And I found that to be very compelling. And I'm still mystified about the radical Whigs. So I'm not quite sure how to map that into our current world.
Right. Let me respond to that. One of the things that I think that it's disturbing, now you don't experience it as much, Meg, right, as a novelist, because when someone sits down with a novel, they've already made a commitment to reading seriously. They want to see where you're going to take something. They want to understand it in depth. But if you write for a magazine or online or in any other way, one of the frustrating things that happens is that your ideas get reduced to the next common denominator, right? So the gentleman's referring to a long piece I wrote about new books on the American Revolution. And one of the things that these new books suggested, and this was where the radical Whigs come in, forgive me if this seems a little in the weeds, but just to clarify it, that there was a kind of international movement towards democracy, towards the things we think of as being enshrined in the United States Declaration of Independence, that those were things that were shared by what this author called radical Whigs in Britain and right around the British Empire and in America, and that we shouldn't think of the American Revolution as being only American, that it was part of a larger ideological transformation of the time. That's all that radical Whigs thing was about. I was trying to explain what this historian believed. But the larger point I was trying to make in that piece is that is to try and locate what's the specific originality of the American Revolution. And it got read by people as though I was trying to deprecate or downgrade the originality of the American Revolution, when what I was trying to do was locate it. But inevitably, when you're trying to locate something, you triangulate it. You say, well, there's one way to look at it here. Let's take another sighting here, and then a third from over there. And we live in an impatient culture. And it's one of the frustrating things is that you want to say to people very often, read the whole thing from beginning to end. Don't read the title and the blurb. Read the whole thing from beginning to end, and you will actually have an experience of argument and evidence leading to a suggestive conclusion. And I know you do that, but it's very frustrating because it gets harder and harder to do that. And when you see your stuff encapsulated, boy, do I sound bad-tempered, but just when you see yourself encapsulated in Twitter particularly, it can be very frustrating because ideas that you've spent very long time trying to get right in detail. People get wrong in gross, and that can be frustrating. Yeah.
You've been so fortunate to have had the experience of living in the two great cities of the world. How would you compare and contrast Paris and New York?
Well, in fact, I truly just got back from Paris last night. I'm still jet lagged, as you can probably see in my eyes, because I was over there doing a lecture and launching the book there. This is going to sound like sort of crazy, but when I first went to Paris, it reminded me of Philadelphia in many ways. And that sounds like a joke, but it isn't entirely, because as you know, there's lots of things in Philadelphia that are modeled, like the Parkway, the City Hall, and so on. But this building, that are modeled on things Parisian. So I always I felt it. That was a sort of little inner joke, little inner pun that I was aware of. Paris is a city that I, dearly love. I got to share for many years with my beloved godfather, Malcolm Eisenberg, who sadly died this year, and this is the first time I've ever been in Philadelphia without his superintending presence. I miss him terribly. But one of the things that I think the greatest differences, and it comes through, is that Paris is a city that is totally lucid in terms of its plan and how you navigate it, and it's a city of continuities. When you step back into Paris, as though you've never left. And New York is a city of discontinuities. When you go back to it, no matter how brief your time away has been, there's always something that will startle you or shock you by its absence. So I dearly love the continuities of Paris, and when I go back, I'm sort of stunned. Martha, my wife, and I are always stunned and say, my God, it's like we never set foot away. I mean, that's true obviously of the physical city, but it's also true of the personal city. It's 25 years can go by with the same cheese vendor in the same cheese store, or the same maitre d' and the same waiter in the same there's a restaurant we like very much in Paris, and we went back there for lunch on whenever the last day was Wednesday, and the maitre d', who we'd sort of known our whole lives, said, oh, I'm retiring now. And we said, why in God's name are you retiring? He said, well, I'm 65. And we hadn't noticed it, as time goes. So I love those continuities in Paris. And I also recognize, and it's one of the themes of Paris the Moon, the book I wrote about living in Paris, that the continuities can be stifling, can be confining as well. And I love the discontinuities of New York, but I also recognize that they can be alienating. They can be disturbing in other ways. Of the city that I describe in this book, from 1980 to 1990, without exaggeration, there's almost nothing of it is left. We moved into an apartment in Yorkville, a little Germany. Nothing is left of York. I mean, the streets are still there, but the neighborhood, the German-Hungarian
and Soho
neighborhood,
has changed so
and
completely.
Soho, which was a village of art, exactly, Meg, which was a village of art, is just now a mall. Nothing is left of, not a single gallery left anywhere in Soho. But the rats are still there. The rats are everywhere.
Although you said, Adam, I wanted to say, I meant to ask you, is it true that cockroaches are mostly gone from New York City?
We investigated this when we were fact-checking the book. We got a lot of little things right and a lot of some things wrong. And there was a period when there were fewer cockroaches because boric acid killed them off. But cockroaches are hardy creatures, and they're on the way back, and they're back.
You write on such a large range of topics. Some of my favorites are the more personal ones. But I'm wondering about the process. Do you present ideas, or do does the magazine
It's a good
suggest?
question. So basically the way it works is I've been there a long time, so I get to be a kind of surly senior citizen now. These kids, what are they writing, all that stuff. Basically what happens is about once a year, I sit down, I have a brilliant editor named Henry Finder, and we talk about what I'm sort of obsessed on. I only write well about things that I'm really sort of obsessive about. And I'm obsessive about a lot of things, but not everything. So I'll say to Henry, I've never written about Trollope. I love Trollope, Anthony Trollope, the British novelist. And he'll nod and say, let's find a Trollope occasion. Or I'll say, I'm reading all of these books about the First World War, the Civil War, like military history. And he'll craft an occasion to do that. So usually what I'm writing for the magazine, even if it's fairly abstract or academic, comes out of something that I've been obsessing over. Then I write the personal essays, which I like best of my work and the ones I tend to collect. But the integrity of those is that they can't become shtick. In other words, if I wrote those all the time, you wouldn't enjoy them anymore. I mean, few enough people enjoy them as it is, but you wouldn't enjoy, even you wouldn't enjoy them, even people who enjoyed them wouldn't enjoy them, because you'd know I was manufacturing them. You'd know that when I write those now, it's because something has happened that is funny enough or odd enough to be turned into a piece of that kind. And then finally, about once, 2 or 3 times a year, Henry Finder or David Remnick, the editor-in-chief, will say, would you write, the editor, we just call him the editor, would you write about thus and so a subject? And very often they know that I read quickly and I don't know how to say no to people. So they'll ask me to do something. For instance, right, when Mein Kampf was published for the first time legally in Germany a year ago, they said, would you read Mein Kampf and write a piece about Mein Kampf? Which was a painful thing to do, but I could do it. Or when Mitt Romney was running for president, David said, why don't you read the Book of Mormon and tell us all what's actually in it? And I did, you know, and so I'm easy to trick into doing things like that. So that, you know, I'm sure they were all judging, well, get Gopnik to read the Book of Mormon. Do we want to read the Book of Mormon? Yeah, I'll read it. So that's sort of the way it breaks down. It's about 2/3 of it is, you know, new books, but on subjects I'm obsessing over. 1/3 is stuff I generate myself. Well, this leaves no room for the other part of it too. And then within that 1/3, about 1/8 is stuff that I'm specifically told that I'm asked to write. And then nowadays, of course, we do a lot of stuff online. We do a lot of political writing online, and that I do with as much alacrity as I can sum it up. John Updike, the great John Updike, greatest writer I have ever met, said to me once, there are 2 kinds of writers in the world. There are yes writers and no writers. And yes writers get their energy from saying yes to as many things as they can, and no writers get their energy from saying no to as many things as they can. And the crucial thing in life is to know which you are, a yes writer or a no writer, because you'll invest more emotional energy trying to decide, whereas if you're a yes writer, you just say yes to everything. And it was a hugely, I knew he meant it generously, he meant reassuringly, he meant just say yes, you know, whatever they ask you to write, just write it, and don't worry about it. Your talent will figure out your readers will figure out what's good or bad.
Is there an anecdote from that didn't make it into From Paris to the Moon that you could share with us?
A French anecdote. Gosh, now I'm trying to think. Was there anything that's anything specifically that happened? You know, at some point, I've been writing a lot from France. People for the last 17 years, even after we left France, I continued going back to France and writing. And at some point, I'd like to write put together a collection of all my sort of post-moon Paris stuff. The one thing that I wrote about Paris that I never put into the book, or a book, was a piece I was particularly pleased with. It was about a house in Paris called the Glass House, the Maison de Verre. And it was a story about how this house was built as a kind of utopian project and how disillusioned and everyone was at the end of it. And then years later, it was bought by an American named Bob Rubin, a hugely wealthy hedge fund kind of guy. And that story of how, it was like a Henry James novel, of how this intricate French, Jewish, modernist work was eventually possessed by a wealthy American. That's a story I've always wanted to tell, and I hope I get a chance to tell it sometime in the...
Hi there, I'm right here. First of all, I want to say you were terrific on the Bill Maher show recently.
Well, thank you.
I was wondering if you had any interest in writing about anything that's going on politically in the country, and also if you can allow us any stories that might have happened that we didn't see on the show while you were filming it.
Bill Maher.
Yeah.
Well, Bill Maher, I think that was the 3rd time I've done Bill Maher. And, the thing is any of you know who've ever done television, here's what happens. You spend like 2 hours getting made up and getting prepped, and then they put 2 mics on you so you won't lose your mic. And then you have to meet all the people you're going to be arguing with, and then you do photographs with them with your arms around each other. It's bizarre. And then you sit down, and then Bill says, and you're under bright lights, right? And you're frozen, and like Ralph Cramden in Chef of the Future, you're kind of like this. And then he says, is global warming actually happening? What do you think? And you say, I think it's actually happening. Too good, it's been a great panel, and thank you for coming. And you have no time, so I'm told that actually I said more than that, but that's all I remember actually saying. And it's a very disconcerting experience for someone like me who is a big mouth and likes to build up to things in ways. And meanwhile, my kids are watching at home, and they're watching sort of as though it's a fight or something. So they're texting me all the time. I have my phone inside, and I can feel it buzzing. It's like they're saying, "Good job, Dad. Dad. You know, you're wrong. You're wrong." That sounds like it's true. And so the thing about that show, I love doing that show, and it's rewarding. The thing about doing television, even political television, that you tend to forget is that it's television first and politics second. And so it's a little bit disconcerting. And Bill Maher is a wonderful guy and very, very smart, and he's a comedian. And so one of the things that the show's about is about making people laugh. So the one insider thing I can give you about it is that they shoot the show live on Fridays, as you watch it live, but they've done a complete run-through of it on Thursday night. The whole show they've done on Thursday night, just to test all the comedy bits, so that the poor writer's room of comedy writers has to rewrite all of that for Friday, depending on what the response is on Thursday. So that's which startled me, right? I thought it was all just kind of happening, but it's really rehearsed in that way. I mean, our part is not, but the payoff part, the comedy part, is rehearsed and rewritten considerably, which I found, as I say, was startling to me. I always assume people just start talking and then they go on, but it's more complicated than that. I like doing it. I think I wore a good shirt this time. My children tell me that, but that's, as I say, it's uncanny how fast TV time races by you and you feel like an idiot when it's over.
That's why you should always do libraries.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Thank you.
I want to thank you. I hope that you got a little bit of a taste of what this wonderful book is
Well,
like.
I want to
and that
thank
you
my
will read it.
darling friend, Meg Wolitzer, for
thank you.
coming out. She's in the middle of finishing a new book, and that she came here means the world to me. Thank you, Meg.